Now, I want to be upfront about something here. Of course, I teach the LSAT for a living. I run an LSAT coaching business. So you should know that's my job. Before I make this last point, I'd rather tell you my bias than pretend I don't have one. But here's the argument anyway. Your LSAT score doesn't really predict whether you're going to be a good lawyer, and that's not what it's trying to do. What your LSAT score actually controls is which law schools admit you, what scholarship money they offer, which city you end up in for 3 years, whose alumni network you join, and how much debt you take on. And every one of those things matters more in a market like this one than it did 3 years ago. Think about that graduate whose DOJ offer got pulled in February of their last year of law school. If they're at Yale, the career office makes calls for them. The alumni network's going to take care of them. They're going to land somewhere reasonable. But if you're at a regional school that charged full tuition and sold you on federal access, you're in real trouble. The difference is the school. It's not your intelligence or your work ethic. It's literally the reputation and the network of the school that you go to. Your LSAT score is the single biggest lever on which side of that line you end up on. Nothing else in the application is close. If you can jump your LSAT score from a 160 up to a 170, you're in a totally different tier. You're getting more scholarship money, taking on less debt. You end up in a different city, have a different career. Your life ends up in a different place because of 10 points on one test. And you don't have to like the LSAT. You don't have to think it's fair, but you've got to know that it is the tool available to you, whether you like it or not. So take it seriously. You get options. If you don't, you won't. Now, the class of 2025 is the first. The LSAT still matters a great deal for not only getting into law school, but also getting you significant scholarship money. Merit-based scholarships are the best way for applicants to typically avoid taking on significant law school debt. And so if you don't apply with an LSAT score, you're missing out on significant financial aid opportunities. And the thing is, your GPA is probably pretty fixed at this point in time, especially if you are looking at the LSAT, you're probably a senior in college, if not a recent college graduate or beyond. And so your GPA is probably close to set in stone, if not entirely set in stone. The LSAT remains your biggest opportunity to not only improve your chances at getting into law school, but also getting you that scholarship money. Now, let me share a story with you. I recently worked with a student who had a low GPA. I'm talking here 3.2, but she was able to outweigh that low GPA with a top LSAT score. I'm talking here a 173. And so this score not only landed her acceptance to a top 20 law school, but it also got her a 75% tuition scholarship, meaning 3/4 of her tuition was knocked out. That scholarship covered the majority of tuition. And so for her, the LSAT was a chance not only to get into a top law school, but also to get a significant scholarship as well. It let her rewrite her narrative. It meant that her GPA was not her destiny. A high LSAT can outweigh a low GPA. So back to this ABA vote here, back to this new. Now, let's get brutally honest here. Law school tuition is not based on what education actually costs. It's based on what schools think students can pay. And for decades, what students can pay really meant whatever the federal government will lend them. That's why tuition spiraled out of control. I mean, think about it. If you got a high LSAT and a high GPA, you get a scholarship, aka a discount. If your stats are more middle of the pack, you pay more. If you're international, first gen, low information, you're often paying full price. Not fair, not transparent, and that system only works because of unlimited Grad Plus. Once you cap borrowing, that whole fantasy collapses. Students will look at an $85,000 price tag and say to themselves, I literally cannot pay this. And schools will have to face reality for the first time in over 20 years. Now, most people assume loan caps hurt low-income first-gen or underrepresented students. But if you zoom out, it looks kind of like the opposite might be true. The students who got hurt the worst were the ones who borrowed the most for the schools with the worst outcomes. These students didn't have financial advisors, didn't have parents who went to grad school, didn't know how to evaluate risk, didn't know to negotiate scholarships, and they trusted in the school's branding and their promises. Then they borrow $250,000 for a school with 50% bar passage, 50,000 median salary, and 50% JD required employment. And that is catastrophic in terms of outcomes or ROI. And nobody warned them about it. Not the school, not the loan servicer, not the government, not the glossy marketing brochure. But capping loans stops that pipeline cold. It forces students to ask harder questions and forces schools to justify the price. That is not gatekeeping in my view, that is basic consumer protection. Now let's talk about the schools that are going to feel the pressure most. Private schools with huge tuition and tiny endowments, lower ranked schools with weak outcomes, and schools that relied on unlimited loans to fill seats, as well as schools with high need applicant pools. These schools have been playing a dangerous game. They admit anybody who says yes, and then they let the government pay the bill. If you're taking the LSAT anytime in the next year, you're going to want to register for it today on the lsac.org website, because LSAC just changed the rules this week, starting with the August 2026 LSAT. The day you register decides the order in which you pick your testing slot. If you register early, you get to pick the better times first and the better test centers first. If you register late, you're only going to have leftovers available to you. I've been personally teaching the LSAT since 2005. Over the past 20 or so years, I've seen students drop 5 to 9 points or more on test day because they took the LSAT under conditions that didn't fit them. And of course, even just 5 points can decide the difference between going to a top 50 school and your regional pool, or between a full merit award and paying full sticker at the same school. Now, registering only takes 5-10 minutes, but if you don't register today, that could cost you more than any prep you do or don't do this summer. Now, there are 8 LSATs offered over each 12-month period, August through June. They are all in person at a Prometric testing center. Remote testing is done for almost everybody. You may have already heard that it's been announced a few months ago already, but there's something announced, buried in the announcement this week. When you register, LSAC assigns you a scheduling window based on the order in which you register for the LSAT. About 4 weeks before test day, you get an email and a text saying that your testing window's open. For scheduling, you log into Prometric and you pick from whatever is still available. For the August LSAT, registration closes June 25th. Scheduling opens July 21st. If you register on June 24th and somebody else registered, say, May 21st, that person's been in the schedule for weeks before you can even log in. They took your slot and you've got leftovers. Now, LSAC's public line on all of this is that they are expanding capacity, more testing centers, more appointments, and that's true at an aggregate system-wide level, but it's also a little bit misleading because you don't take the LSAT in aggregate. You take it as one person trying to book on a Saturday morning at the Prometric testing center closest to where you live, which is going to fill up first, regardless of how much capacity exists across the system. The Wednesday 4 p.m. at a center across town is still open in late July, which is how LSAC can honestly claim capacity exists. Now, there is no override for this. You get what you get when your window opens, and they don't want you getting upset about it. Now, there are 2 exceptions to in-person testing. If you require approved medical accommodations at a Prometric center that they can't provide, and test takers who are more than 180 miles or 3 hours from a center with capacity. If you qualify for the distance exception, the trap is you've got to register first, then apply with documentation, and your scheduling order is already set when you apply. If your exception gets denied, you've now got a later testing window. So if you might qualify, register first, apply second. Now, most people think test day is just the 4 sections, and the test day starts, in truth, the moment that you wake up. Let's say you've been practicing at 9 a.m. for 6 months. Every timed practice test on your tracker came from a 9 a.m. study session, and your body and your brain are calibrated to 9 a.m. Then LSAC drops you into a 2 p.m. slot because the morning times filled up months ago. And so you're sitting down for section 1 on borrowed energy. You haven't taken a timed section past 12:30 over your entire prep. LSAC made a major shift a couple of years ago. The writing sample is now argumentative, not descriptive. It's evidence-based, not preference-based, and it's analytical, not reflective. And so the older prep books are outdated. The Reddit threads from 2017 also outdated, and random blog posts explaining the old writing sample are completely irrelevant. The new version focuses on something very simple. Can you read source material, create a clear argument, Acknowledge counterarguments and write like a functional adult. That is it. You don't need literary flair. You don't have to sound like Shakespeare's lawyer, and you don't need to pull a Legally Blonde Elwood's filibuster. You've just got to show basic argument competence. The LSAT writing sample used to be basically ignored, and schools needed it, but almost nobody read it. But in 2026, it's becoming more important, not because law schools changed, but because you changed. You now have access to artificial intelligence. 10 years ago, the only way to get polished personal statements was to hire a boutique consultant for thousands of dollars. But now, you can clean up your writing using a free chatbot in 3 seconds. And admissions knows this. They are not naive. And so the writing sample is their one chance to see how you organize ideas without help, whether you can build a logical argument, whether your grammar is functional, and whether your writing ability matches your polished application essays. You don't need a masterpiece, but you do need alignment. They're going to be asking, does this sound like the same person who wrote the rest of the application? If the answer is yes, you're good. But if the answer is, there's no way a human wrote this personal statement, the writing sample becomes the red flag. So here's how to succeed on the writing sample. First, you want to be clear and concise. Short sentences, clean syntax, simple vocabulary. You are not trying to impress anybody. You don't want to drop a random 5-syllable word in the wrong context. The second rule is to follow the instructions exactly. LSAC gives you source material, and so you want to use it explicitly. Quote, paraphrase, reference, whatever. Just use the information they provide. Don't bring in outside examples. Don't reinvent the assignment. And don't wander off into your personal story about how college changed your life. You want to stay inside the bounds of what is required. Now, you've also got to address the opposing side without switching sides. And this is the part students misunderstand. Acknowledging counterarguments does not mean arguing both sides, changing your mind halfway, or writing a balanced essay where no one wins. It means stating what the other side believes, explaining why that's reasonable, showing why your side is stronger, and that's it. That is the exact skill you're going to use in law school, weighing arguments and making a clear call. You also want to make a clear thesis and stick with it. You pick a position early, you announce like you mean it, and you stick with it all the way through. Wavering is going to translate as confusion, and lawyers do not waffle. They pick a side and they stick with it. Now let's look at LSAC's official sample prompt, the one about the purpose of college. The prompt gives you several perspectives. One argues that college should prepare students for careers. Another argues for the value of a broad liberal arts education. Another emphasizes societal or civic benefits. Your job is to pick a side and argue it using their material. So let's say you argue the primary purpose of college is to prepare individuals for career success. Here is how you would structure it. Paragraph 1 is your thesis, 2 to 3 sentences. You state your position. You give a quick preview of your reasoning. For example, maybe you say, colleges should primarily prepare students for career success because this aligns education with economic realities and student goals. It's clean, it's direct, with zero fluff. Then in paragraph 2, you make your strongest argument. You use the source material to support your main point. You bring in one piece of evidence or reasoning from LSAC's prompt. Then in paragraph 3, you give your second argument with another reason, another piece of evidence. You're still drawing from the provided perspectives. Then in paragraph 4, you address the opposing view. You acknowledge that the liberal arts perspective has value. Then you explain why it's less compelling given your thesis. For example, while a broad education can produce well-rounded thinkers, the evidence shows that students overwhelmingly expect college to lead to employment, and institutions should meet this primary demand. It's clean, it's respectful, and it's forceful. Then, in paragraph 5, you give a concise conclusion, just a sentence or two where you restate the thesis with no new ideas, no new evidence, no dramatic ending. You just close the loop and you stop. Now, people will ask me, how long should this be? Of course, you are not writing a dissertation. You don't get any extra points for length, and you do not need creative flourishes. Ideal length is 5 paragraphs, 300 words. It's short, it's clean, and it's organized. It should feel like a structured email written by somebody who has a brain. That's all you need. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect. Law schools do not expect perfection. They only expect competence. So you're showing you can follow directions, you can read, you can organize ideas, you can argue a position, you can acknowledge counter arguments, and you can write in normal functional English. That is it. LSAT does not reward effort, it rewards strategy. So my fix for you is to cut the fluff and focus on targeted practice. If logical reasoning trips you up, don't kind of study all question types. Drill down into your weakest ones like necessary assumption or strengthen until they become second nature. For reading comp, stop obsessing over every detail in the passage. Instead, learn to read for structure. I'll share more on this later. Now, one of my students, Maya, was stuck at a 158 for months. She was convinced she needed to do more. But once we focused her study plan on targeted drills and prioritized review over busy work, she increased her score to a 166 in just 5 weeks. Now, of course, you can't create a winning strategy if you don't know where you're starting. So my first step for you is to take a full-length timed practice test. Then analyze your results. Look for patterns like which question types trip you up the most. Are you consistently running out of time in certain sections, or maybe you miss more questions in the first half of the test rather than the second? Now, here's the thing. Your diagnostic score is not a reflection of your potential. It's just a snapshot of where you are right now. Think of it like stepping on a scale before starting a fitness program. You're gathering data, not passing judgment. Now, don't skip this step because you're afraid of a low score. One of my students, Chris, started at a 145 and didn't even want to look at his diagnostic results. But after we broke down his weak areas, he realized he'd been making the same mistakes over and over again. By fixing them, he hit a 160 within just 2 months. Now, here's the golden rule of LSAT prep. Consistency beats intensity every single time, and that comes together with building a study plan that actually works for you. So 3 to 6 months before test day, you want to study 2 to 3 hours a day, 5-6 days a week, focusing on building foundational skills. Then take one exam every couple weeks to track your progress. Then 1 or 2 months before test day, shift into timed practice sections and full-length exams, drill your weak areas relentlessly, and simulate test day conditions to build up your mental endurance. Then in the final week, cut back on studying to focus on reviewing key concepts. Of course, at this point, you want to prioritize rest, confidence, and mental clarity. Of course, given the recent changes to the LSAT, logical reasoning is now 2/3 of the exam because they removed logic games. So here's how to dominate logical reasoning. First, understand the question types. Don't just memorize them, know what each type is actually asking you for. For example, for necessary assumption questions, you want to look for what is a missing link between the evidence and the conclusion. For strengthening questions, what would make the argument more solid? For weakeners, what pokes a hole in the argument? You also want to practice dissecting arguments. Think of every single logical reasoning question like a mini puzzle. Break it down into the evidence, the conclusion, and any assumptions, meaning what's left unsaid. Then predict before you look. Before reading the choices, ask yourself, what would the right answer look like? This stops you from falling for tricky traps. Now, of course, you don't want to neglect reading comp. I know it gives a lot of you nightmares, but it's because you're approaching it the wrong way. A lot of students are reading the passage like it's a history textbook instead of a puzzle. The fix is to read for structure, not details. The LSAT doesn't care if you know every name, every date, or every example. What they do care about is what's the main point, how do the paragraphs relate to each other, and where does the author reveal their opinion. After each paragraph of the passage, take a moment to pause and ask yourself, what is the purpose of this paragraph and how does it fit into the bigger picture? Now, here's a secret most students don't know. You don't need to answer every single question in order to hit a 170 plus. Instead of rushing through all 25 questions in logical reasoning, aim to nail the first 20 to 22 questions with precision, flag and skip a few that seem hard, and come back to them later. It's better to confidently answer the 22 easier ones than to get bogged down or stuck on the hardest ones that you could always come back to later. Now, of course, don't neglect review because that's where the magic happens. For every question that you get wrong or have difficulty with, ask yourself, why was my answer wrong? Why was the right one right? And what trap did I fall for? And how can I avoid it the next time around? You also want to make sure you're building up your endurance and focus as you get towards test day, because the LSAT is not just a test of logic, it's a mental marathon. Make sure you're taking several full-length timed exams in the final month before the test. Stick to the official format of the actual exam to build up your stamina, and practice staying focused for the entire duration of the test. Now, if you're